Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's July 10th, and we have a lot to talk about, because this week we're talking about cannabis and MS. Today, medical marijuana is legal in 30 states for treating specific conditions, including multiple sclerosis. And there's growing interest on the part of people living with MS and MS researchers in using cannabis to treat MS symptoms. Thanks to social media, a lot of opinions about cannabis and MS are posted as if they're facts, and that's not always the case. So I thought it would be useful to take a closer look at cannabis and MS, try to demystify it a bit, and give you an idea of what some of the research is actually telling us. We'll talk about which MS symptoms cannabis might be good for, and which ones it might not be good for. And I'm going to give you a whole collection of links to the actual research that's been published about cannabis and multiple sclerosis in today's show notes. So I'll recommend that if your podcast app doesn't give you access to our show notes with the links intact, then just visit our website at realtalkms.com, where you'll always find detailed show notes with clickable links. But before we get to our conversation about cannabis and MS, there are a few other things that you should know about. It seems as though we can't get through more than a couple of podcast episodes without me issuing some kind of a new warning that if you live in the United States, your ability to access health insurance is once again being threatened. Last month, I told you that the Trump administration has filed a brief in federal court urging the court to throw out the Affordable Care Act's protection for people with pre-existing conditions. Now, this amounts to a frontal assault on my family and every single family in the United States where one of its members is living with a pre-existing medical condition like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, MS, and too many others to name. And in response to this action, the National MS Society joined forces with the American Cancer Society, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, and the American Lung Association in filing a friend of the court brief citing the devastating impact that millions of families would face should the court invalidate the protections for people living with pre-existing medical conditions. Well, that case won't be decided overnight, and even once it's decided, you can bet that the decision will be appealed to the Supreme Court. So while that battle lies ahead of us, there's something new to report, something that's happening right now that will most definitely destabilize the entire health insurance market and most definitely cause health insurance premiums for 2019 to rise. First, let's fill in a little background. Because the Affordable Care Act requires that health insurers provide coverage for people with pre-existing medical conditions, some health insurance companies take on a large financial burden when they provide that coverage to a large number of people. To kind of even out the risk, all of the health insurance companies contribute to a fund that's used to reimburse health insurance companies for the losses they incur when they insure people with pre-existing conditions. And there's a specific financial formula that allows for these payments to be calculated. So I'll say two things about these payments in this fund. First, the total fund is huge. Payments from this risk adjustment program to insurance companies totaled more than $10 billion for 2017. And the second thing I'll say is that none of this money, not $1 of the $10 billion that's due to be paid out for this past year, is taxpayer money. It's money that's paid into the risk adjustment fund by the insurance companies to be divided up among the insurance companies using a very specific formula that is actually part of the Affordable Care Act. It's written into the law. Well, last February, a court in New Mexico handed down a decision that the formula used to calculate how much of the risk adjustment fund an insurance company should receive, well, they said that formula was flawed and needed to be fixed. Now, this past January, a federal court in Massachusetts ruled that the formula was fine the way it was. No changes were necessary. So last week, the Trump administration pointed to the 6-month-old ruling in New Mexico and suspended all payments from the risk adjustment fund to the health insurance companies. Again, this represents $10.4 billion in payments that were about to be made. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which oversees this part of the Affordable Care Act for everyone, announced that they were freezing the payments until the formula could be reworked. So the reality here is that the payments will eventually be made, but they're going to be late, and no one knows how late. But what everyone knows is that the one thing that insurance companies uniformly hate is uncertainty in the marketplace. And this decision to freeze this $10 billion in payments has created massive uncertainty in the insurance marketplace. Now, America's Health Insurance Plans is the name of a trade group made up of health insurance companies. They released a statement in response to this action saying that the suspension of payments would create a market disruption at a critical time when insurers are setting the new premiums that are going to be in effect for next year. I'll read you a short excerpt from their statement, so I'm quoting now. It will create more market uncertainty and increase premiums for many health plans, putting a heavier burden on small businesses and consumers and reducing coverage options. None of that, not one part of it, sounds good for anyone. So that's the latest activity designed to undermine the benefits provided under the Affordable Care Act, and one that millions of Americans are going to feel firsthand as we sign up for health insurance coverage for 2019 and find that our premiums are all going up. Now, I would guess that if you're listening to RealTalk MS, it's because you or someone in your family is living with multiple sclerosis. Well, if you live in the United States, your ability to access quality, affordable health care is under siege. And I found that there's nothing more empowering than advocating on your own behalf in your own best interest. So I invite you to join me and become an MS activist, because taking action is going to create a better quality of life for you, for your family, and for millions of other families across the country. To find out more about becoming an MS activist, you can visit the National MS Society's website at nationalmssociety.org and click on Get Involved, and then click on Advocate for Change. And I'll provide that link in today's show notes. We talk about clinical trials pretty often on the podcast, and that's no real surprise, because clinical trials are sort of the foundation of drug or medical device development. But you might be feeling a little confused when it comes to understanding the difference between a phase 1 clinical trial, or a phase 2 clinical trial, or a phase 3 clinical trial, because each clinical trial is designed to do something a little different. All new drugs and medical devices go through several stages of testing before they can receive approval from the FDA and then be used to treat patients. And these clinical trials are the formal studies that are used to determine whether a new drug or device or treatment is safe and effective. So I thought it might be helpful if we just took a minute to run through the various types of clinical trials and clear up any confusion about what they're each designed to do. Generally, there are 4 types or phases of clinical trials, and each phase represents the next stage or the next step in the development of a new drug or medical device. A phase 1 clinical trial is the initial trial of a drug or device, and it's designed to determine whether that drug or device is safe for use in humans. And a phase 1 clinical trial might generally involve anywhere from between 20 and 80 participants. Now, a phase 2 clinical trial might also provide information about the safety of a particular drug or device, but phase 2 trials are really designed to provide evidence of whether a drug or device has a beneficial biological action for the treatment of a disease. And phase 2 clinical trials can involve somewhere between 100 and 300 participants. Phase 3 clinical trials are larger studies that are designed to provide the FDA with more information about the safety and the benefits of a new drug or device. Phase 3 clinical trials can involve between 1,000 and 3,000 participants, and they collect information about side effects. They might even compare a new drug or device to others like it that are already on the market. We tend to talk a lot about phase 1 clinical trials and phase 2 clinical trials and phase 3 clinical trials because these 3 types of clinical trials are associated with new drugs or treatments that haven't yet been made available. But there are also phase 4 clinical trials. These are the post-marketing studies that are done after a drug or device has received FDA approval and is made available to patients. These post-marketing studies generally involve large numbers of participants, and they can look at identifying any problems that might be associated with the long-term use of a particular drug. They generally provide additional information on safety and effectiveness of a drug or medical device once it's already being used by large numbers of patients. So I hope that helps to connect the dots when it comes to understanding the different stages of clinical trials. I'll remind you that last week we mentioned a really helpful brochure that the National MS Society has put together. It discusses some of the issues you should be thinking about when or if you're considering participating in a clinical trial. I think it's a great resource, and I'll include a link to that brochure in today's show notes, as well as a link to clinicaltrials.gov, which will let you browse the more than 277,000 clinical trials that are currently underway. You can search for clinical trials based on a specific condition or disease like multiple sclerosis, and you can even look at only those clinical trials that are currently recruiting participants, or you can see all of the clinical trials that may or may not be recruiting additional participants. And let me add one more thing about clinicaltrials.gov. Last week's podcast episode was all about stem cell therapy. And I spent some time talking about stem cell clinics that may not be 100% legitimate. They may not be giving you the whole story about what their treatments can and cannot do. These places make promises that can't be delivered. They tend to bend the truth when they're talking about the science behind their particular flavor of stem cell therapy. And one thing they like to remind you about in their advertising is that they're doing a clinical trial. In fact, they usually direct you to clinicaltrials.gov, where you can look up their so-called clinical trial and see for yourself and come away thinking that therefore it must be 100% legitimate and above board. So this is a part of their deceptive practices that I didn't get into last week and wanted to kind of close the loop on today. Clinicaltrials.gov is a website that's provided by the U.S. National Library of Medicine. And the U.S. National Library of Medicine operates that huge database, but they don't verify the scientific validity or the relevance of any of the clinical trials that are listed. Having a clinical trial listed on clinicaltrials.gov does not mean that the study has been evaluated or approved by the U.S. government. It does not mean that the study is being funded by the National Institutes of Health or any government agency, and it does not mean that the study is being reviewed, approved, or otherwise regulated by the FDA. It only means that the stem cell clinic themselves listed a clinical trial in this database, and that in itself doesn't make it legitimate. To be clear, you'll find plenty of completely legitimate clinical trials being conducted by legitimate research centers when you search through the database at clinicaltrials.gov, but simply having a clinical trial listed in that database doesn't make it legitimate science. And that's one more reason why being an informed medical consumer is so important. And here's news about a legitimate clinical trial that's currently recruiting participants. MedStar Health Research Institute is recruiting participants for a nationwide clinical trial to look at the natural history of urinary symptoms, how those symptoms impact your daily life, and when symptoms most likely are related to a urinary tract infection. To qualify as a participant, you must have been diagnosed with MS for at least 1 year, have experienced more than 3 episodes of urinary-related symptoms since your diagnosis, and use an assistive device. Participants will fill out a urinary symptoms survey by email every 2 weeks for a year, and do a dipstick analysis of their urine, and participants will receive compensation. If you're interested in participating in this clinical trial, you can contact Dr. Amanda Rounds at area code 571-332-9887, or you can email Dr. Rounds at amanda.k.rounds@medstar.net. That's amanda.k.rounds@medstar, medstar.net. We'll include a link to a sample of that online survey that you'll be asked to complete every 2 weeks, along with the contact information for this study in today's show notes. In last week's podcast episode, we told you that the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK had reversed itself and announced that Ocrevus would be approved for treatment of patients with relapsing remitting MS who are experiencing MS relapses or can show MRI evidence of new areas of disease activity and who are either unable or unwilling to be treated with Lemtrada. And this was pretty great news for people living with relapsing remitting MS in the UK. Unfortunately, and maybe even a little ironically, people living with progressive MS in the UK didn't get such good news, because this past week, the same organization, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, chose not to approve Ocrevus for use by the National Health Service in treating people living with primary progressive MS. The decision was based on their assessment of the cost-effectiveness of Ocrevus. In other words, they didn't think that Ocrevus offered good value for money, which, by the way, was the original conclusion that they reached when they first considered Ocrevus for treating relapsing remitting MS. And after announcing their decision not to approve Ocrevus for relapsing remitting MS, the drug's manufacturer Genentech renegotiated the price of the drug in the UK, and that led to the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence reversing their original opinion and approving the drug. And what's so ironic here is that Ocrevus is the only drug that's been approved by the FDA and the European Medicines Agency for treating primary progressive MS. So it's probably safe to say that this isn't the end of the story. And we can expect that the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence recognizes that their refusal to approve this drug is proving to be an excellent tool for renegotiating the final price of the drug in the UK. So please stay tuned for further developments. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast today, there continues to be a growing interest in using cannabis to treat multiple sclerosis. So I thought it would be useful to take a closer look at cannabis and MS, to try to demystify it a bit, and to give you an idea of what some of the research is telling us. And if you're a regular listener, you know that when it comes to discussions about science, I like to start by clarifying the terminology. So, marijuana has about 60 different active chemical compounds, and these are called cannabinoids. The two main chemical components of cannabis are cannabidiol, or CBD, and delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. And studies have shown that cannabidiol, or CBD, can be beneficial as an anti-inflammatory, as an antipsychotic, and as a neuroprotective agent. Today, medical cannabis is legal in 30 states for treating specific conditions, including MS, and 16 states have legalized CBD, cannabidiol, for medical use. There has been and continues to be a lot of research done on the effect of cannabis and MS, and I wanted to share highlights from some of that research. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'll include links to all of the published research that I'm talking about so you can drill down for any additional details you might be interested in. For 10 months in 2016, the Michael J. Fox Foundation and the National MS Society hosted a web-based survey about the use of cannabis for Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis. During those 10 months, 595 people completed the survey, and the results indicate that about 40% of the people living with Parkinson's disease or MS are using cannabis today. Other studies put that number even higher. And the folks who responded to that survey reported that they were experiencing improvements in mood, memory, and fatigue. And they noticed a lowering of their neurological dysfunction. Among the survey respondents who were living with MS specifically, they reported that cannabis negatively affected their balance, made it a little worse than it was. And overall, the cannabis users indicated that they were able to reduce the amount of prescription medication that they had been taking since they had started using cannabis. Now, an article published in the Journal of Frontiers in Neurology by researchers from the University of Colorado, the Colorado School of Medicine, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign concluded that CBD should be used by people living with MS to reduce fatigue, pain, spasticity, and even improve mobility. Researchers at the University of Rochester MS Center surveyed people living with MS and transverse myelitis, asking them to report their, quote, real-world experiences using medical marijuana. And about 77% of the survey respondents said that medical marijuana was helpful in managing spasticity and pain and had no side effects whatsoever. 70% of the respondents indicated that using medical marijuana had improved their quality of life. Some patients were able to reduce their reliance on prescription drugs to manage some of their MS symptoms, and respondents said that they were paying somewhere between $100 and $300 a month on their medical marijuana. When you compare that to the cost of some of the prescription drugs being used to manage some MS symptoms, that sounds like quite a good deal. The American Academy of Neurology has published guidelines for using cannabis to treat MS symptoms. The AAN looked at the clinical trials for CBD and THC, as well as for synthetic CBD and THC compounds that had been created in laboratories. And their guidelines indicate that some cannabis-based compounds could be used to manage MS-related pain and spasticity. The AAN guidelines indicate that there is no evidence that cannabis-based compounds help manage MS tremor, and there appears to be some conflicting evidence among the clinical trial results as to whether cannabis-based compounds can help to lessen frequent urination. And I'll include a link to the American Academy of Neurology's guidelines so that you can review them, print them, and take them with you to your next appointment with your neurologist if you're interested in determining whether this might be a viable treatment plan for you. And while we're talking about discussing medical cannabis with your doctor, there's an interesting survey that was done in Australia. The University of Sydney surveyed 640 Australian general practitioners, and the survey results showed that over 60% of the respondents favored prescribing medical cannabis for MS-related spasticity. Now, currently, it's against the law in Australia for a general practitioner to prescribe medical cannabis. 61% of the survey respondents indicated that they had fielded one or more patient inquiry about medical cannabis in the past 90 days, and the majority of these doctors believed that their own knowledge of the subject was inadequate, with only 28% of the respondents indicating that they felt comfortable talking about medical cannabis with their patients. So it sounds like there is an opportunity for a teaching moment there as well. So where are we when it comes to cannabis and MS? Well, right now we're holding incomplete information. Research results seem to indicate that medical cannabis offers benefits in managing MS-related spasticity and pain, but there aren't any standards, sometimes not even agreed upon definitions when we talk about what is medical cannabis, what goes into the compound, what are the ratios of ingredients being used. Now, the good news here is the FDA has just approved the very first cannabis-based medical treatment, and while it isn't for MS, it illustrates the FDA's willingness to provide its set of safety and effectiveness standards to medical cannabis. So we need to see more clinical trials of cannabis-based treatments. Just last month, MMJ Bioscience, a company that specializes in medical cannabis products, requested approval from the FDA to begin phase 2 clinical trials to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of that company's THC and cannabidiol compounds for treating MS symptoms. And you can be sure that we'll keep you updated on this quickly evolving area of MS research as it continues to move forward. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Let me just add that it would mean an awful lot to me if you wouldn't mind taking a quick 2 minutes to leave a rating and review of the podcast. Just visit realtalkms.com/rating, and in a couple of minutes, you could do me a big favor and leave that rating and review. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.